I think Lexington is as vibrant as it's ever been in my lifetime. And I think you're absolutely right. We are at a crux in our development and how we decide what the next 50 years are going to be.
Welcome back to DevelopLex. Today we are sitting here in SVN at 270 South Limestone with Burgess Carey. Traditionally, we ask you. We sat for the last little bit and kind of talked about your background, and there's a lot there. There's a lot of different hats that you wear in your life. So customarily, we have the guests kind of introduce themselves because we're gonna leave some things out if we try to introduce you. So again, we have Burgess Carey on today, and he's gonna tell us a little bit about how he got to where we're sitting today.
Well, thank you for having me on. I'd like to say I'm a fan of the podcast and absolutely a fan of the people you've had on prior. A lot of really talented individuals in our community. We're really blessed to have trying to get things done. I grew up here in Lexington. My family's been in Lexington for generations, and I grew up a coach's son, essentially, of a contracting firm, a construction company, Carey Construction, and my father developed roads and subdivisions, and the Lexington Quarry, which I grew up working for. So I was really lucky to be able to see the business of construction and development and the impact that it had on the community at an early age. But I grew up here really loving the outdoors. As I got older, while I was really fortunate to be working for my dad's company, I got super curious about other parts of the world, like many people do, and loved to do a lot of things that Lexington didn't have. And so when I got into my college years, frankly, I didn't think that I would end up here. Things changed when conditions changed for me, and I ended up coming back to work with my father he made a deal with me that he'd help me start my own business if I worked for him, and I saw it as a 2-year mission, and here I am nearly 40 years later.
Yeah.
But very fortunate. I got a chance to work with him for several years before he died, and at that point I'd kind of gotten my start and been through some pretty turbulent times in the late 80s and early 90s that were also very educational for me, and I give my dad credit for that. Kind of as a result of that, I was looking for something to do as a young man that would give me independence and take advantage of the things that I knew how to do. And I came up with the idea of self-storage. And I used self-storage out in Jackson Hole when I was young. And I kind of noticed that there was a place where people lived, and they lived above it, and they rented a truck, and wow, they rented these lockers out, and that has to be kind of a good business, And I had seen my dad in the 80s. He was, as I said, in development. And development is cyclical, as you all know. And in the late 80s, there was a recession, the S&L crisis, and he got caught up in that. He ended up having to sell his company. But to his credit, he called me up one day. I was pouring concrete out at the Lexington Airport on third shift, and I was going home about 7 o'clock in the morning. He called me up and he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm going home to go to sleep." He said, "Well, what do you think?" And he said, "I want you to come to the office." And I was like, "Why?" And he said, "Because things are as bad as I've ever seen them in 30 years. And he said, "I want you to sit on the couch in my office for the next few weeks and see how people act when things are bad." And that ended up being the greatest education I ever had. Not only from the subcontractor and contractor's perspective, but from the banking perspective and business owner perspective. And as I said when we were talking before, he was my hero and my teacher. I wish I'd been a better student, but that was an invaluable experience to me. And when I had the chance to do something, self-storage appealed to me on a lot of levels, because in the end, I thought if I could live there and I could run it and it doesn't work the way it's supposed to, I can negotiate. And unfortunately got lucky, and it didn't happen that way. And at the time there was a real demand for self-storage, and so that kind of started me on my way developing my own projects.
So, in all of the different things that you do, share about what those are, and then what you identify as when you meet somebody out and you're like, "Hey, I'm Burgess, and I am a blank."
I'm a developer, and it took me a long time to say that. I'm a business owner, but a developer to me may mean different thing than it does to other people. I like to turn negatives into positives. I like to create uses where I see a demand, and apply the background, the skills that I've developed to that, and that's manifested itself in a lot of different ways. But in the end, I'm a developer.
So, first project was self storage.
Yep.
Background of seeing how contracting works, seeing how bricks and sticks move into being a grander piece of real estate. How did self storage look when you first got started? How has it evolved to what it is now, and what do you see the future?
Well, it's an entirely different business than it used to be. And one of the things that I didn't know at that time was one of the real founders in self-storage nationally is from Lexington. And it was a guy named Bob Sutherland. And as I told you earlier, one of my first jobs when I could drive that I did with my dad or for my dad was I sold rock from the Lexington quarry. So I got to meet all the developers around town and see what they were working on. And Bob Sutherland at the time was developing the Richmond Road shopping center. But he would take the back 40 of any property he had that wasn't retail or visible and build these little storage lockers. And he started doing it, I guess, in the early 80s. And I guess he and some of the other developers around the country who were starting to do self-storage recognized the need for an association and a legal representation at the national level and state level. So they formed the Self-Storage Association, and he was one of the founding members. Anyway, back then it was a very different business. It was back of the envelope. You take your piece of property that you don't have any other use for, and you build some buildings with some roll-up doors. What's evolved in the time that I've been into it is now a very sophisticated business. It's very competitive. It's moved from the back 40 to the front main on main corner. Now you have to invest heavily in IT, and where for maybe the first 25 years of self-storage that I was in, the supply did not meet the demand. For the first time in that industry, supply has exceeded demand in most markets. And with continued sophistication of demographic studies and marketing, all these are things now that if you're not on the cutting edge, you're not competitive. Because now we're used to it. For example, when I first opened my first facility in 1993, we probably got 30, 40 calls of prospective renters. By the time I sold that facility in 2015, we didn't get calls. You had to find that renter, even then, online. And back then it was on the internet, but now, of course, everything is on the phone. And you have to have an IT structure that identifies people who have that need before they have it. And you have to be in a retail location, which is much more expensive and a lot riskier. And one of the most exciting things about the industry to me, and I think this is going to impact all light industrial, is contactless move-ins, Bluetooth locks, and fully automated facilities. And that's what I'm building now. And I believe that technology will continue to trickle down and apply itself to even smaller developments because of what it does in terms of labor efficiencies. primarily.
SVN Stone Commercial Real Estate is a full-service commercial real estate firm located in Lexington, Kentucky. Affiliated with the SVN International Network, SVN has over 200 offices across the globe. The SVN Stone team consists of experienced commercial real estate advisors in the heart of the Bluegrass. SVN helps their clients with commercial property sales, leasing, investments, and property management. Let SVN help you with your commercial real estate needs. Check us out at svnstone.com. I was sitting here like a little bit, you just jumped into it. I was a little bit giddy because I realized we haven't really talked to anybody that has developed self-storage at scale on I mean, there has been some for sure, but we definitely have not done a deep dive on self-storage, and we don't have to spend our whole time today talking about self-storage, but it is an asset type. I got in the business in 2017. And I feel like self-storage was one of the assets that was trading like crazy around 2015 to 2020. And that seems to have slowed down a little bit. I've literally never done anything self-storage related. But from what I understand, it was a very hot asset for years and years and years. And now it's slowed down a little bit. Is that accurate in terms of trading volume? Maybe not development, but trading volume.
Yes, it is accurate. And it's because overdevelopment. Every real estate cycle in every niche gets overdeveloped. Self-storage for the first time found that to be the case, because what happened was, well, up until the 2010, 2015, there were probably 40 to 50,000 storage facilities in the United States. 80% of them were owned by mom and pops, or, maybe 1, 2, 3 facilities, regional operators at best. But during that time, Wall Street became aware that during these recessions, the most recent one being 2008, the Great Recession then, and even previous ones, self-storage had maintained its performance as well as anything, maybe with the exception of multifamily. And up until then, self-storage was a sub-niche of light industrial, and it really wasn't recognized as an institutional asset class. When Wall Street recognized that, what they started was a massive consolidation phase. Up until then, Public Storage, whose owner actually lives in Lexington, ironically, now, which started in California, was the only major national player. But when the Real Estate Investment Trust got in it and got the equity behind consolidation and tried to achieve national brands, there are primarily 4, maybe 5 that did that, then the cap rate started to get compressed. They recognized this was a consistent cash flow. They recognized that unlike, say, retail, it wasn't subject to major swings if you lost a big anchor, and had price elasticity. You should theoretically be able to follow a disinflationary period as well as an inflationary period, because all of the rents are monthly. Self-storage is entirely created by a law called the Self-Storage Act that's been passed in all 50 states, and it was passed by the Self-Storage Association that I mentioned earlier, of which Bob Sutherland was one of the founding members. And it allows for month-by-month rentals and the ability to lien and liquidate differently than a warehouse. A warehouse operator is a bailee, and that is a legal term. And a bailee is responsible for what is stored in a warehouse. Self-storage is not that. Self-storage is not responsible for what's stored. Well, so the rent is, less than a warehouse by a factor of 8 or 10, okay? Because what you're doing is renting the space, and the tenant is taking their own risk on what they store. And with a month-by-month lease and an accelerated lien process, and ultimately to auction, you, as an operator, if someone doesn't pay, can essentially get them out of that unit so you can rent it again much faster than an apartment or a single family home, or certainly a warehouse. So in exchange for that, the rents are lower. And what Wall Street recognized was that month by month lease allows for rents to be pushed or discounted on a daily basis. And in today's environment, we all know about dynamic pricing, and that's become, one of the most important things for an operator to implement. Otherwise, you're just not competitive.
So I would assume in that process that, like everything else, technology has accelerated and probably pushed out some mom and pop operators that aren't willing to, buy into dynamic pricing and the tech and the upgrades in self. I would imagine that asset has changed drastically.
That's exactly right. And up until the early 2000s, the cap rate valuation of a storage facility would have reflected a light industrial flex space. We'd be in the nines, the low tens, that kind of thing. Well, technology and then the recognition by the real estate investment trusts of this income stream have pushed that cap rate down to the point where the operators now they're seeing a lot more, their assets worth a lot more, so they start selling out. And now this consolidation, which allows this national branding and marketing and investment in IT, makes it further competitive. And that's exactly where we are now. Merchant developers, going in, recognizing this and building to spec for these real estate investment trust companies, all the major markets, pretty much flooded most areas. I mean, it's now much more like multifamily where you can find opportunities, but you need to be right on where the new growth is, or you need to recognize a demand that hadn't been met. It's not like you can build it and they'll show up anymore.
And along your path in development, or have you traditionally been Lexington based? Are you going where you see opportunity? Where kind of are you looking opportunistically?
My focus is Lexington and Kentucky, anywhere within a couple hours drive. I do have a business, a consulting business, and we've worked in the Southeast and Southwest, and I did that intentionally. I have a partner in Houston because I wanted to get to know other markets. As you guys know, Lexington's a really challenging market to develop in, and some of that is a good thing. It preserves our quality of life. But as a developer, there's certainly areas of the country that move a lot faster.
So what are some of the other projects or asset types that you play in?
I like flex space. There's a product now that's been developed by others. I've developed it in the past that I really like, that kind of combines flex space and self storage and uses technology the way we were just talking to create efficiencies and more appealing space for a pretty well ignored niche. And by that I mean contractor units. That landscape has changed over my career, where typical contractor space in the past might have to have a little office in the front, a warehouse in the back, and the developer would have to have that office because it would have a higher per square foot rent. And to make it pencil out, it would be blended with the warehouse. All right. Well, the contractors, as I built these spaces and I had self storage, and I'd noticed guys going from a small 10 by 10 to a 10 by 20 to a 10 by 40, and now they want a warehouse with a dock. But then the next thing I started to notice was they would come to me and say, well, I don't really need the office. I just need a bigger warehouse. I need a 14-foot door, But, and I don't really want to sign a lease. And brokers wouldn't bring me a lease for those uses because they didn't want to sign a long term. They weren't worth much. So I started thinking, all right, well, how do I develop a hybrid here? And they want to pay with credit card. So what I did a project back in 2006 where we built essentially small warehouses with big doors that were operated like self-storage. And that contractor could pay with a credit card, only had a month-by-month lease. But as the operator, I had the ability to lien their goods if they didn't pay. And, that's a great niche in the business because they got to go to work the next day. So I think that is going to continue to grow in the flex space niche. And I think that model will be applied to existing buildings as well. So that's I think a real strong growth area.
um, we would be remiss to not spend a significant amount of time. We talked about earlier. You are involved in some other different types of projects here in town. Boone Creek being one of them, and I think that that is something that our audience will be very drawn to. We talk about um, all the qualities that Lexington has. And I think that we're always trying to discover more and more positives about the community and bringing people to the community. And so I think Boone Creek's one of those places, and kind of the passion that you have for the outdoors is something that is so different from self storage and flex as well. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your other involvement.
Well, as I mentioned, I'm from this community. I grew up here. I love this community. I always felt that my interests, though, maybe were aligned in other areas. And to make a long story short, I had the opportunity to stumble literally onto a piece of property in the Palisades area on Boone Creek right before it empties in to the Kentucky River. A friend of mine had bought an adjoining property, and we were in our late 20s, and he invited me down there to see this beautiful creek and gorge that I'd never seen. Growing up here, I had no idea there was something like that in Fayette County. And then one thing led to another. We were on the creek and we saw this abandoned house, and how did it get here? It's in the bottom of this gorge, and there wasn't even a driveway to it. It washed out, and at the top of the hill, there's this another abandoned gas station. You know, how did all this work end up here? And again, to make a long story short, my friend who was an attorney helped me figure out who owned the property. And the property had been purchased at auction by a man who now at this time lived in Florida, and I had known his name but didn't know him personally. But he'd essentially abandoned it. And we found out that the mortgage was held by some local banks, and but they'd never foreclosed. Well, again, continuing to research, it took about probably 3 years. We figured out that at the top of the hill was this truck stop that had been also abandoned, and that the fuel tanks, which were still in place, had leaked, and the fuel had gone into the creek and killed fish, and all this happened in the 70s. But long story short, at the time, coincidentally, I had started a hazardous waste and remediation company, and we specialized in pulling petroleum tanks and remediating the soil. And so I fell in love with this property. It was spectacularly beautiful, and I had thought that there was nothing in Lexington that was for me. But here were trout in the creek and white water that you could paddle, and rocks you could climb, and it looks like something in Western North Carolina or in Eastern Kentucky. And I thought to myself, how can I share this? You know, if I can buy this, people need to know, because there have to be people in this community like me that grow up here thinking they want to leave because they like other things. I mean, everyone loves our signature industries. The horse business is what we're known for, and it brings so much to our community. But if you're not in the horse business, the only way to interact with it is to go to the races twice a year. You know, we obviously bourbon is a signature industry now, and you know, that's great. Well, I felt and still feel like our community has more to offer than gambling and drinking. Not that those aren't wonderful things for our community, but the outdoors being my passion, I thought to myself, you know, if we can figure out a way to sustainably create an outdoor recreation facility here that could be a model for not only our community, but for Eastern Kentucky, and show off a different color to the palette of what we have to offer as a community. Because coincidentally, this property was right on I-75, right at an exit. And if nothing else, can be an additional tourist draw to Lexington. And so, again, to make a long story short, I started out in the late 90s, and the first step was to create a fishing club, which has now been, we're in our 25th year of existence. And about 10 years ago, we expanded to create world-class tree-based canopy tour. We now have a challenge course. We have some lodging for members of the club, and we have a couple of Airbnb permits on neighboring properties, and a lot of expansion possibilities that I'm real excited about.
Craftsman Contractors is Central Kentucky's one-stop shop for roofing, windows, siding, and gutters. CraftsmanContractors.com/contact us will get you straight to the form you need so that their team will get in touch about your project. Or just text Steven at 859-246-0108. When they finish your project of windows, siding, gutters, or roofing, you'll see what they mean when they say we build with integrity.
Yeah, I think just to kind of reiterate what you just said, obviously horses, bourbon, all of that's great. I was at Keeneland yesterday. So obviously a huge fan of horse racing, but there is a piece of living in Lexington of wanting to continue to make sure that people know that there's more here that patrons outside of Lexington and that residents of Lexington can access. Because to me, sometimes the horse industry feels like it's such a far reach for a huge portion of our 330,000 person population. And I think that mindset of what are the other industries that Lexington can pull people in and serve its residents with, how can we continue to figure out what other niches there are in Lexington?
That's right. And, as wonderful as that industry is to our community, as important as it is, by its nature, it's not necessarily interactive. And when 30 plus years ago, our community identified the green space as our factory floor and the need to preserve it, there was a movement to do that, and that's been done. Now, the challenge moving forward, I think, is how to provide public access, how to provide that interaction with our green space so we continue that appreciation. I like to compare it to museums a couple of generations ago to what they look like now. When you put everything behind a rope or over a wall or in a glass box, that's great. It's preserved. But you go to any museum now, and what you're going to see is interactive exhibits, things that kids can play with, things that cause people to identify with the things that we are trying to preserve. And we need to do the same thing here. And I think that's going to be a real challenge. But we do have so much more to offer, and we are the gateway to Eastern Kentucky. And with the state's focus now on adventure tourism, hoping to replace the coal economy, Lexington is in a nexus of the path towards so many great tourism opportunities. And I really do think Kentucky is in an excellent position for growth in that way in the future. But Lexington as a community has to really decide if it's going to be an extractive economy, ultimately being driven by revenue streams that are not from here. Many other communities that don't have the same growth restrictions are able to do things like major industrial parks that bring in employment opportunities, from starting wage jobs to well-paying jobs. Lexington's really challenged in that. So the way we're going to be able to have to do that is working regionally, because those industrial parks aren't going to be in Fayette County for the most part. But we do have the highest quality of life. But if we're going to attract those people or retain the people like myself that grew up thinking, well, I need to be in Colorado or California or North Carolina, then we've got to have a diversity of activities and things that cause people to enjoy what we have to offer.
It's funny when you interview enough people, I start to blend stories. I think the rope analogy that you made with the museums, that kind of mimics what Bryce Bell talked about. Is that accurate to say?
And he's a champion of just how many people get to go out there and feed a horse a carrot.
Well, so the horse country movement, and I'm friends with Price, and we have talked about this, and that there's a reason for that. And in fact, in conversations about it originally, Van Meter Pettit wrote an article in the Herald Leader that called it Preservation 1.0 versus Preservation 2.0. I believe horse country had their own consultants come in and talk to them about how they could create more immersive experiences to generate more interest in thoroughbred racing. And it's along the same lines. You have to get people involved.
Yeah, so to me that feels I'm just so glad to have people like you in the community and Price and other folks that are really making a push towards like, let's open the gates and allow people to enjoy these experiences. And what other experiences can we draw people into the city that we all love? I mean, I'm sitting here, it's Friday afternoon. I'm looking out the window right now, which you may not be able to see on the camera, but it's like, I can't imagine a more beautiful place to live. We're right downtown. I know that we're 15 minutes from a horse farm. We're 25 minutes from Boone Creek. Just a great place to live. What would you, I kind of want to circle back, but it has to do with all of the things that you're involved in. How would you describe, you've obviously been a developer for a very long time. How would you describe something as being a quote unquote successful development as you have just continued to progress the things that you develop, whether that's outdoor recreation experiences or a self-storage facility? I know there's different barometers as to what, would be qualified as successful, but now that you've touched so many different types of projects, how would you describe something as successful?
Well, I think, like you said, that's a subjective answer for any developer, right? Personally, I feel the most satisfaction of taking a negative and turning it into a positive, identifying a demand that maybe had not been considered before, or adding something to something that might be more traditional that creates additional demand. I think ultimately a successful project is sustainable.
I think to your point, I think it can be difficult when you're going into the realm of development, which obviously Ross works for a company that is doing large scale developments, and you can probably speak to that, but there are pro formas that you have to hit in order for some, especially when you're pulling investors of this is how it has to be. But I think it's so interesting for me to think about like Boone Creek, for example, or any sort of experience economy developments as to how you can define something as successful, because clearly you're impacting a community in a way.
It's much easier to pro forma 12 to 15% equity return for a entitled residential development or a commercial development. I mean, there's a lot more science behind that and a lot less judgment than something in the experience economy. And, while I say a project being sustainable is a sign of success, obviously there's a lot that goes into that. If it's a storage facility, it's not sustainable if it's not returning a competitive return to the investors. But if it's a treehouse development that's never been done before, it's a pretty impossible to predict what that demand is going to be other than your gut. One thing I've learned in my career is that while developers are often very creative, being the first person to market with a new idea is often not very successful. And Lexington has a lot of examples of that. I mean, the festival marketplace that was originally developed is a perfect example of that. It's still evolving, and it's never really been what it could have been originally. No fault of the developers. It was just before its time, And I think there's examples of that everywhere. If you get too far out on a limb, you're probably, the benefit of the project's going to go to the second guy or the third guy.
DevelopLex is also sponsored by Community Trust Bank. Hi there, this is Cam Dacey, Commercial Loan Officer at Community Trust Bank and avid DevelopLex and Middle Tech podcast listener. Community Trust offers a wide variety of home loans, commercial loans, and small business loans to suit your financial needs, as well as mobile banking, internet banking, and bill pay. Their friendly and professional staff would love to assist you at one of their 6 Lexington locations. Community Trust Bank is committed to building communities built on trust. Member FDIC, equal housing lender, subject to credit approval.
Well, I think that's interesting. You're clearly the first one out there. There's now Grimesville Winery, where Dr. DeSimone has an epic bocce tournament. You have a new park going in there. You've had a couple different versions of a river restaurant that keeps coming back after so many knocks.
Boondogs.
Boondogs is out there now.
Mom's Lavender is there. We've created a ecotourism zone, or outdoor recreation zone along. I was really lucky to be in the position I was that I described earlier. When I found the property and also having the skills that I did, and also knowing most of the major landowners in the area. And if I hadn't been in that position, I don't think it would have ever gotten done. And I'm not going to say that it was as successful financially as the other things that I do, but it was a passion project and it is sustainable. We have the Canopy Tour now is in its 6th year of operation. We provide jobs. We have between a dozen and 24 employees seasonally, most of whom are young people, most of whom have said to me that, wow, I was going to leave after college. I didn't want to wait tables and I wanted to go somewhere else, but this is great. I'll stay here for a while. They're not permanent jobs. But the coolest thing about that project, which I don't get very often in my other projects, is that everyone enjoys it and they smile when they're coming off. And they often, I mean, the majority of the time, especially if we do 60 to 70% of our business with people from out of state. And most of them come off the tour saying, wow, we had no idea something like this was in Lexington. This is great. What should we do next? So we point them to Proud Marys or to Boondogs or to Horse Country USA or to, Deer Run Stables or to Canoe, Kentucky and Red River Gorge. And so, from that aspect, the project has been very successful and I'm really proud of it.
What would Ross and I are sitting here today, both 28 years old, obviously so much to learn still. I think DevelopLex was really born out of sitting down and having coffee with people like you and really wanting to pick your brain as you've been in the industry for so long and have done some successful projects. What's some advice if you could go back to Burgess Carey at 28 as you're entering that phase and trying to think big and take on big projects? What's some advice that you would offer for someone that's really thinking like, I think you have a unique perspective because you wanted to bring something to Lexington that really, that was existent, but nobody knew it was existent. I think that they don't necessarily have to develop an outdoor experience, but they're thinking, I want to stay here. In your example, I don't necessarily want to move to Western Carolina or East Tennessee or whatever it is, Colorado, California. It'd be cool to stay here and have my community. What kind of advice would you offer to them trying to develop in the city of Lexington?
Well, advice is worth what you pay for it, right?
Luckily, DevelopLex is free. So
that's my point. So read. Number one, read. Get involved in the community, local, what is happening, what is involved in politics, what is involved in planning. If you are a developer, you have to understand zoning, you have to understand the regulatory process, and it's one of the most boring subjects out there. It's very difficult to stay involved in, but it's critical. If you want to be a developer, patience is super important, and it was very hard for me to learn. You can't force developments. They have to, if they're going to work, timing is everything. And for my own sake, if it doesn't work on the back of an envelope, or if it doesn't work in simple terms in its first phase to create a sustainable project, it's not worth doing. You can't get, again, too far out there in your projections to where, it's not sustainable until you've hit every mark and you're in your final phase. That's me. you know. But I think the most important thing is you do have to follow what's going on in your community to look for those opportunities because, you know, we're an MSA of 500,000 people. So if you're going to do something in this community, somebody's looked at it already, you know, and you have to bring something original.
As we obviously you've been here most, if not all, of your life, or in and around central Kentucky. What do you feel? We've talked a little bit offline ahead of time that we are in a unique spot, and if people have listened to one of our, I think we're at 70 episodes ish now. If you've listened to our 70 episodes, you get the recurring theme that Lexington is in a really unique, I would call it, tipping point. I'm also 28, so sometimes I'm like, I don't know if we've been saying this for 50 years, but it feels like we're in a really unique spot right now. What do you feel kind of the general sentiment around Lexington right now and paths forward that you may be able to offer, you know, some of the people that are thinking, I want to stick around, I want to make an impact on the community. How would you encourage them to maybe get involved or feel one way or the other about kind of paths forward in Lexington?
I think Lexington is as vibrant as it's ever been in my lifetime. And I think you're absolutely right. We are at a crux in our development and how we decide what the next 50 years are going to be. You know, when I was young, the movers and shakers got things done by picking up the phone and calling each other and just doing it. And it was critically called an old boys network. That changed about 30 years ago. And the movement to stop the green space development, which was spearheaded by a handful of people who are still involved in our planning. And what I see now is that goal has been achieved. And now we're actually confronting problems that were created by that goal unintentionally. Too much traffic, gentrification of neighborhoods, unaffordability in housing and jobs, lack of jobs across the board. All these things are the byproduct of a no growth mentality. But I think our community has been consistent in identifying that our green space, that factory floor, is precious to us and does drive our future. And not only in the horse business, but in tourism. So what we have now is a challenge in how we're going to adapt to that and how we're going to maybe solve or at least mitigate the problems that have come up. Whether that's regional planning, which has been tried for decades and generally has not worked at all, or whether it's becoming a little more flexible and a little more creative on how our green space and our urban areas are developed. And that's happening.
Well, and I think it's interesting going back to your point about zoning and knowing it, even though it's one of the boring things. Green space, you can ask anybody in Lexington, hey, what's agriculture, what's green space? And they're going to come up with this horse farm mentality. But that's not the corn farmer. That's not the quarry that's out by the interstate. That's not the places by the river. That I feel like it's a misunderstood zone. And maybe is that we just haven't learned everything of what's ag, what that is.
Well, it's a lot of land and not a lot of people, right? And it's obviously a valuable industry. And as any industry, it's been protection oriented. And it's a cyclical industry. I mean, even the people in it, Price would be the first to tell you there's good years and there's bad years. And what we don't want is during the bad years for the pressure for those landowners to develop their property in inappropriate ways. And again, that goal has been established. Okay, well, what are we going to allow them to do to preserve that factory floor? All right. And if we take the position that we're going to restrict uses, other green uses that would preserve that area, then we're really further hamstringing those property owners. And their only exit becomes selling out to somebody who's probably bigger than them and probably not even from here. because we have such a beautiful resource. And again, I think that threatens the public's appetite to subsidize preservation of more space. But if we could get the public more engaged in what uses we can give them, which understandably, it's not appropriate to have a whole lot of the public right beside a breeding shed of $1 million horses. We get that. But there are a lot of areas in this county, watershed areas, for example, riparian borders, that could be promoted for tourism. The Kentucky River Palisades is the number one. I mean, I used to go on these Chamber of Commerce trips, which are great when you go to other communities and you learn about what they're doing. And invariably at the end, we'd all do a survey and what does Lexington need? The number one response would be, we need water. Well, we've got it. And there have been studies, federal government studies, Army Corps studies that have identified the Palisades. It's incredibly rich in biodiversity. It's spectacularly beautiful, but there's no access. And, that's one example. And others around the community will have different ones in different ways to develop appropriately. But whether it's Windy Corner, where you can go and, sit outside and have a nice lunch, and see the beautiful area around you, or whether it's Boone Creek Outdoors or Boone Creek or Boondocks, which was a former gas station as well, and which is fabulously successful on a sunny day. You can't get in out there, There's a demand for it. And our community, the music business that's grown up here has been great. We have a new brand going, I think, there. What they've done downtown with the Burl, innovative redevelopment. I think all of us are for that. But I think, we have a community full of creative people, and I think we need to engage them and not just have a knee-jerk negative reaction to new ideas.